All of you listening are lovely, wonderful, brilliant, and fantastic people. And whatever point of the day you're listening to this, I hope you have a great rest of the day. Those weren't unexpected compliments, but I thought I'd start a bit unexpectedly. Hi everyone, and welcome to Just for Kicks. Last week, I asked you guys to share an unexpected compliment you had received, and I found out that there were not many compliments being thrown around unexpectedly, and therefore, not as many answers this week. Now, my earliest memory of the word compliment actually has nothing to do with receiving one. I remember being a kid and having a conversation with an older cousin who was explaining to me the difference between compliment with an I and compliment with an E. One was something nice you said about someone, and the other was when something went well with something else. I remember being fascinated by the fact that two words could sound exactly the same but mean completely different things. And apparently, even as a child, I was fascinated to learn the difference. So that was probably my first real introduction to the word compliment. And now, all these years later, I've somehow made an entire podcast episode about this topic. Now, as usual, before I get into your answers or even mine, I had to do some research. And not just about the word's meaning or its etymology. Now, if you're curious about the etymology, the word came into our language from the French and Italian and the Spanish, like many other words. But I wanted to condense this huge topic of compliments into something I could talk about. To be honest, there were many different threads I was working on. There was the one about the psychology of compliments. I read an entire article from a website called Psychology Today. Okay, fine, I skimmed through it. But then I went down the compliments and parenting rabbit hole. How more parents should look at giving non-physical compliments to girls and make it more about their strengths and intelligence. But that was quite heavy and it didn't really fit with this week's question about the unexpected compliment. So I settled on a story from the start of this year and I tied it back to the article from Psychology Today. I have a group on WhatsApp where we have a pinned message that says gut is everything. And other messages which I remember that said gut health is greater than therapy and other intelligent nonsense that we spewed back in January this year. And before you wonder what has gut got to do with compliments, I promise I have a connection. I'd like to inform you that compliments have a direct correlation with your gut. And let's have a quick biology lesson while we're here because I think it may help you too. I feel like most of us have heard of dopamine and serotonin. If I had to explain them to a 5-year-old, I'd say dopamine is a cheerleader and serotonin is a tiny helper, both inside your body and both working together to make you feel happy and calm. And here is where the compliment comes in. A compliment makes you smile or at the very least gives you that little warm feeling inside. And smiling itself can trigger a chemical reaction in the brain, including the release of chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, which are associated with positive feelings and reduced stress. So there's actually some science behind why a nice compliment can make you feel good and why it can improve your day. And now to the compliment gut serotonin axis. More than 90% of the serotonin in our body is actually produced in the gut. It has important functions in digestion as well as signaling throughout the body, which also is somehow tied to making you feel amazing and keep your spirits high. So my WhatsApp group may have been onto something when we decided to concentrate on gut health at the start of this year. And when we proclaimed that it may just be greater than therapy. I'm kidding. Please do not take medical advice from me and my WhatsApp group. But it did get me thinking about how something as simple as the compliment can set off this whole chain of reactions. Someone says something kind, you smile, your brain responds, you feel good, and maybe you carry that feeling with you for the rest of the day. Mark Twain famously said, "I can live for 2 months on a good compliment." And I think the research proves it. I mean, I've been carrying some of my compliments for decades, so Mark Twain underestimated how far I can stretch it. Now to the answers this week. This first person had a tough time remembering an unexpected compliment. I'm starting with my mom's story because it was a sweet memory I remembered on her behalf. It was a story involving my grandmother, her mother-in-law. It's one of those memories that even if the compliment is not yours, it's a fun story to share. Or a memorable one. My grandmother had fallen a few years ago and was coming back from the hospital. My mom wanted to welcome her home, so she decided to decorate the front yard with flowers and line the inside of the house with them as my grandmother would walk in. She collected the flowers from our garden and prepped everything for my grandmother's welcome. Just a small gesture to lift up her spirits. What my mother expected, she said, was that my Ajji would simply be happy that my mom had done this for her. My Ajji was very aesthetically minded and loved the finer things in life, so my mother knew she would appreciate the effort my mother was putting in. But what surprised my mom was what happened afterwards. My Ajji, after entering the house, hugged my mom and started crying. She said that she wasn't even welcomed this lovingly after her wedding. She felt special decades later, and it was when she was coming back from the hospital. My mom was not looking for appreciation, but my Ajji's reaction told her how much that effort had meant to my Ajji. And a compliment and an appreciation that had gone both ways. And once we started talking about this memory, it actually brought out a different answer from my mom. The answer my mom eventually came up with was actually a story from when I was 5 years old. At the time, my parents had already been living in Indonesia for about 5 years, and I think my mom was still settling into life there. During one of our trips back to India, I missed about a month of school. The timing could not have been worse because before I left, my class was learning something very basic in maths, the greater than and less than signs, and we had just started working with two-digit numbers when I left for India. In the month I was away, my class had somehow moved on to three-digit numbers. So when I came back to school, I was completely clueless. My mom went to the teacher and asked her what she could do to help me catch up. The teacher told her to go right back to the basics. Start with numbers from 1 to 10. That is what my mom did. For the entire month after we were back, she sat with me and taught me those concepts from the beginning until I caught up with the rest of the class. By the end of the term, I had caught up enough to be in the top 10 in a class of about 45 students. At the parent-teacher meeting, my teacher asked my parents who had done all this work with me, and both my parents said it was my mom. My teacher told her that she really appreciated what she had done. Getting a child back up to speed that quickly and getting them to perform that well was a real achievement and required a lot of skill and effort. And my mom remembers that as a huge boost to her confidence at the time. Which is interesting because when she told me this was her unexpected compliment, I thought, why was that unexpected? She had done all the work, she knew how much effort she had put in. And my mom's story actually made me think about something that came up in quite a few of my conversations. A lot of people had a really hard time remembering compliments. Not because they had never received them, but because they apparently had not given them enough importance to remember. And I started wondering whether some of that has to do with how we were raised. A few people brought this very Marathi family tendency to hold back on praise. There's almost this idea that if you praise someone too much, you'll make them complacent. You do not want to coddle them. You want to keep them grounded. So you point out what they could have done better. You tell them where they fell short. And praise is almost treated like something that has to be earned. There was also this idea that you do not really praise your own family. You can criticize your family with absolutely no hesitation, but praise, that is supposed to come from other people, strangers even. And I think that might explain why my mom's story stayed with her. She knew she had put in the effort, but someone outside the family recognized it, gave it a name, and essentially told her, you did something really well here. And maybe that is why it became her unexpected compliment. The next story I got was about when compliments suddenly became abundant. This person grew up without receiving a lot of compliments, and then as they got older, they reached a point where they fit whatever ideal the people around them had in their heads. Suddenly, the compliments started coming. But by then, something had already changed. They noticed the compliments that came their way were associated with appearance, clothes, the way someone looked, and essentially with fitting a certain idea of what was desirable. And that made compliments feel superficial. If you were only being complimented because you now fit the ideal, how much of that compliment was actually about you? And later, when some of those compliments came from men in college or other places and crossed the line into being creepy, compliments stopped feeling entirely something to take note of. So now, the compliments they actually believe tend to come from people they trust. From friends, their partner, their family, people who genuinely know them. And after thinking about my question for 3 or 4 days, they eventually came up with what they considered the best compliment they'd ever received. Also, I would say the best unexpected compliment they'd ever received. A friend once asked them if they were bisexual. And I thought that was such an interesting answer because what they liked about it was not really the question itself. It was that someone could look at them and think you could be attracted to women. And for them, that felt like an unexpected kind of recognition. They felt that they were cool and they thought they had edge. And that was something they hadn't thought about themselves. And if you had heard their audio note, you would have seen how it still made them happy. The joy was very evident in their voice. Now, not to make this about feminism, but given the general state of men in the world today, I can understand why being told you could be attracted to women might feel like a compliment. The third person gave me a completely different answer. They said that growing up with insecurities and fears meant that almost any compliment feels unexpected to them. They're just not really expecting one. Now, I'm obviously not a psychologist, but if I were a psychologist and if I were allowed to diagnose my friends based entirely on a podcast answer, I'd say this person is in denial. Because I know this person. And I've told them this before. They're one of the smartest, strongest, and most beautiful people I know. And yet somehow they continue to behave as though all of this is breaking news. So maybe that is why every compliment feels unexpected. If you refuse to believe the compliment, of course you're going to be surprised every time someone gives you one. Now, I'm not naming names, but they know who they are. And I'm sure they'll disagree with this assessment too. And I apologize in advance for the diagnosis. I'm actually very glad I'm your friend and not your psychologist. Because these compliments are going to keep coming your way. They may be unexpected for you, but they're certainly not unexpected for the rest of us. One thing I've noticed this week is that everyone struggled with coming up with an answer when I said the word unexpected. And that made me wonder why. Maybe we just do not get that many compliments that genuinely surprise us. Or maybe we get them and do not really register them. Because I think a lot of us have built a pretty structured idea of who we are. We know what we are good at, we know the personality traits people tend to notice, we know the things people compliment us on. And once you've heard the same kind of compliment enough times, it stops feeling unexpected. It's almost just confirmation of the person you already believed yourself to be, or some kind of a validation. But then I started thinking about what happens when someone says something that completely contradicts a picture you have built for yourself. Do you dismiss it? Do you question it? Or if it comes from the right person, do you actually believe it? Because I think I have one of those stories. Growing up, I was the elder sibling. I was strong-minded, strong-headed, and probably a little quick to anger. And I think some of that is still there. I've just hopefully become better at understanding people and myself. But growing up, those qualities were often associated with the way I spoke. I was told quite a lot to watch my tone. If I snapped at someone or said something too sharply, I'd hear some version of watch out for that tone of yours, you could hurt people and not even realize it. And when you hear something enough times, it becomes part of how you see yourself. It becomes a fact. So I grew up thinking that I sounded harsh. Maybe sometimes I did. I'm not saying everyone who told me that was wrong. But somewhere along the way, I can be rude became I have a rude tone, and those are not necessarily the same thing. Then I started my first job. About 6 or 8 months in, I had become friends with someone there. You know that stage of a friendship where you trust someone enough that if they tell you something about yourself, you will actually listen? One day, completely randomly, they said to me, "You have one of the sweetest voices I've ever heard." And then they basically said that if I asked them to do anything, they would do it, no questions asked, just because of the way I spoke. I remember being genuinely stunned because this was not a compliment I had ever associated with myself. In fact, it was almost the opposite of what I had been told about myself for years. There's a quote by Bryce Courtney that says, "Lives have swiveled over a chance remark." And I think that's what happened here. I would not call it life affirming because it was not affirming something I already believed about myself. It was more like life shifting. Because here was someone I had known for maybe 6 months who I had come to trust telling me something about myself that completely contradicted a perspective I had formed over years, partly because people I loved and trusted had repeated it to me. I actually carry that compliment around like a kid carries their favorite plushie. I do not know exactly what it gives me, but I hold on to it. Because whenever someone tells me that I'm too blunt or too assertive or too something, there is this little voice in the back of my head that says, well, someone once told me I have a really sweet voice. And very recently, I was telling someone else the story and they added to it. They said, "Oh yeah, you do have a calming voice." So now I've added another little layer to this imaginary support plushie of mine. I hadn't analyzed why this compliment stuck with me for the last 12 years. But maybe it is because it did not just make me feel good, it gave me permission to see myself as something more complicated than the one version of me I had been handed. You know how so many people say they hate listening to their own voice on a recording? I've never really had that. I've never had that moment of hearing myself back and thinking, oh God, is that what I sound like? I think somewhere along the way, I just believed this person. They said I had a sweet voice, and for some reason, that became the voice I believed I had. And now, 12 years later, I'm sitting here recording a podcast and sending my voice out into the world. Well, a very small part of the world because there are about only 15 of you, but still. And I think that's pretty remarkable when I look back at it because one person said something to me at 22 and I believed her enough that 12 years later I'm still letting that one compliment shape the way I hear and see myself. And then there was my friend who had a very recent memory from their trip to India. They cooked a simple cabbage bhaji, and if you know anything about cabbage bhaji, it's a basic everyday home cooked dish. Their mama was visiting and if he was served this simple lunch. He said something that made them very emotional. He said that they made it like his mother, my friend's Aji. Now, my friend's Aji had passed away recently, so the emotions are still very raw. And here they were being complimented on something as simple as a cabbage bhaji, only to realize that somehow in making this ordinary dish, they had brought back a very specific memory of someone who was no longer there. All those emotions and one simple bhaji. It caught them off guard. It made them question the simpleness of a dish and how it evoked this memory for everyone present there. Finding that one piece of someone who wasn't physically present there but alive in everyone's memories and now in the food that my friend was making. It was heartwarming and emotional, and I can understand why it made my friend feel all of the feels. And then, just when I thought I'd heard all the stories, another one came in from my aunt. She received a completely unexpected text from one of her nephews, one of my cousins, from my uncle's side of the family. And if you know the men in my family, they're not exactly known for sending emotional appreciation texts. So naturally, she was surprised. He complimented her and went on to describe her as a genuine, hardworking, mentally strong, empathetic, loving, and caring person. And then he said something I thought was particularly lovely. He told her she was a force unseen. Now, if you know my aunt, you'll agree with the analysis. We all know that about her, but none of us sent her this unexpected text. And I think what made it so unexpected was that we just do not really do that in my family. We might notice the effort, we might say something in passing, but actually taking the time to sit down, put all of those thoughts into words and send them to someone, that is unusual for us. And there is something different about having a compliment written down. You can actually go back to it. You can read it on a day when you need the reminder. It becomes a little piece of evidence that someone saw you, appreciated you, and took the time to tell you. Now there's one more thing that I remember from that evening, which is my uncle feeling a little left out and a little miffed that he hadn't received a text like this himself, which actually makes the story really funny. Eventually, he got me to promise him that I was supposed to send him a similar text in the future. This has become one of those family stories we remember because honestly, who expects a text like that from a nephew on a completely ordinary day? So after all of that, I think I've come to a fairly simple conclusion. Take the compliment. Maybe it's something you've heard 100 times and it does not surprise you anymore. Maybe it's something you've never thought about yourself. Maybe it recognizes an effort that nobody else has noticed. Maybe it reminds you of someone you miss. And maybe you do not have to immediately decide whether the person is right. You can just take the compliment. Say thank you. Let yourself enjoy it for a minute before your inner critic takes over. Smile a little more. Let your serotonin soar. And maybe keep the compliment somewhere. You never know when it might become a plushie you carry along with you 12 years later. Anyway, that's enough compliment analysis from me for one episode. Thank you to everyone who sent me your stories. I genuinely loved hearing them, and I think I have learned that an unexpected compliment can be about so much more than the words themselves. I would implore you to keep your eyes and ears open and seek out those serotonin and dopamine and boosting words. You never know when one of them might stick with you. Now for the achievements for this week. The first one is I sent out a few housekeeping emails I'd been procrastinating on, and I made my quarterly trip to the Indian store. We are now stocked with snacks and goodies. Then I also renewed my library card, so I have a new book that I'm reading, and I'm hoping that it'll be a fun one. And then finally, I had my sister remind me of the name of an old Romanian dance pop group from the noughties. Accent, if anyone is interested to know. I'd been racking my brain for some time trying to remember what they were called, and my sister gave me the answer in about 30 seconds. Not exactly a personal achievement, but now I can finally stop that worm in my head from annoying me. Now for the question for next week. This one hopefully is easier than trying to rack your brain for unexpected compliments. The question is, if you could use only one utensil, fork, knife, or spoon, for the rest of your life, which one do you pick? Send me your answers before next week because I'm curious to know if cutlery also divides us all. Thanks for listening and keeping me company. Take care. Bye bye.